Hello, and welcome to this discussion on the Soviet troop withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989. This is one of a number of discussions we'll be having on events that either symbolize or helped bring about the end of the Cold War. The series is being brought to you by the American Democracy Project, the Department of History, as well as the Mike Down Center for Indiana Politics. Our panelists today are Jim Lutz, a professor from political science, and Livschiz, assistant professor in the Department of History, Shane Swoverland and Staci, Bougher, both students here at IPFW. My name is Andy Downs. Welcome to all of you. So let's get started right away. Anne, when did the Soviets make the decision to invade Afghanistan?
The Soviets made the decision to invade Afghanistan in December of 1979. And it's a very interesting, kind of the decision-making process is a very, very interesting one because, first of all, we have the war, the decision to go to war being a perfect illustration of the perils of going to war based on faulty intelligence. Because what happens in the Soviet case over the course of 1979 is that essentially the Soviet Politburo convinces itself against its own better judgment that getting involved in Afghanistan is actually a good idea. And we have information from April of 1979. Well, I should say that there were requests for Soviet assistance. Before starting in April of 1978, when the glorious April Revolution, also known as the bloody coup that brought to power a pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan, took place, and so they've been providing assistance, advisors, supplies, military equipment. But in April 1979, when the demands for Soviet troops became more insistent, the Soviet Politburo decided that it was really not a good idea. And it's very interesting. Just a couple of quotes from the original decision. They didn't want to do it because they thought it would seriously harm their international integrity, that it would turn back the process of détente, that it would reveal the weak position of the Afghani government, and it would sort of allow others to decide to try to push the counter-revolutionaries to get them out of power, and then they have to stick to this. So this is April 1979. By December of 1979, they make the decision that they are, in fact, going to intervene. What changed in the meantime? Well, there are a couple of things. Basically, the KGB began to observe the situation, and the situation began to deteriorate very, very over the course of 79. And basically, the KGB managed to convince the Politburo that, in fact, the imperialist forces headed by the United States were intending to threaten Soviet Union's southern borders through Afghanistan with the goal of creating a second Ottoman Empire. And there were a couple of, there were a number of things that contributed to their fears. They became convinced that Amin was actually an American agent, that he was trying to work together with the Americans, and it didn't help that he knew English but didn't bother to learn Russian, and he actually, interestingly enough, had a master's degree in educational administration from Columbia. So there were all these things that clearly were pointing to the fact that he was planning to turn sides. They were worried that he was going to do a Sadat on them, right, that as soon as the situation stabilized, he was going to kick the Soviet advisors out and start working with the United States. And from then on, this obsession with the possibility of foreign intervention, the possibility of the destruction of the April Revolution, all of this and then so that with the fact that the CIA was in fact planning to attack the Soviet Union, made it clear that Amin needed to be removed. And the only question was, do we do it through secret forces from the KGB, or do we let the Soviet troops actually go in on it? And of course, it didn't also help that this is right around the time when the United States is having problems with Iran, and so a number of members of the Politburo were sort of saying, well, if the United States can bring in its navy into the Persian Gulf, tens of thousands of kilometers away from them, this is on our border. We should be able to do, whatever we need to do.
Did the Soviet government attempt to justify their action to their citizens? Their citizens were not really a problem. The beauty of living in a fairly closed society is that the citizens of the Soviet Union were really not their primary concern. This is done, we have to keep in mind that this is done very, very secretly, to the point where actually the decision was made only by 4 of the 15 members of the Politburo. They essentially made this decision at Brezhnev Dacha, and then later on they got the rest of the Politburo to rubber stamp it because not everybody agreed that it was such a good idea. And in fact, the military was against it, but they chose not to sort of push their point and kind of, and really went along with it. And so when it happens, it became much more important actually to justify it to the rest of the world than actually to the people within the Soviet Union. So it was explained that, the Soviets were invited in and they're offering, friendly assistance.
So Dr. Lutz, what reason did the Soviets give to the rest of the world for their invasion?
Well, like most governments in most situations, they give multiple reasons for for something as straightforward as an invasion. One of the factors that probably helped is that about the same time the Soviet troops were coming in, there was a change in leadership in Afghanistan. And I think in part in relation to what Ann said, there was a hope that the new leadership would be more effective in controlling the situation. The Communist Party in Afghanistan had two factions. But at one level, their explanation was the fact that they were invited in by the new government and that it was there to provide assistance to a fellow regime. Less directly stated, but at least understood by those who watched, was the idea, of course, that the Soviet Union would find it difficult to let a communist regime, once established, fall. That would set a bad example, and it wasn't so much that they were worried about the communist regime falling in Afghanistan. It set a not very good example for Eastern Europe or for Cuba or other places. And so the idea of maintaining a communist regime once established, a variation of the Brezhnev doctrine, which, of course, once a communist regime was established, the Soviet Union had the duty and the right and the obligation to defend it. And so here was an example of a communist regime that was facing some difficulty, and the assumption that there was a need, even a pressing need, to come in and safeguard the regime from dangers of being overthrown. And you don't want to establish a bad example, of course, in letting such a regime fall, which shows weakness. There was some effort to play to public opinion on a global sense, but also to some extent, it depends on the circumstances. Détente clearly suffered as a consequence of the invasion, and so they needed to provide an explanation of providing assistance. And of course, there was always the possibility, if the United States got too vocal about pointing to our little episode in Indochina, and that where we were helping a friendly regime for a very long period of time, and what was good for the goose is good for the gander.
Can I just add one more thing? I mean, one of the really interesting things is that they, on the one hand, they hoped that the Soviet Union assumed that the United States would do nothing about it. At the same time, they were actually fairly proactive in in trying to develop positive public opinion. I mean, there's this great, the great boon to Soviet historians has, of course, been the opening up of the archives and all sorts of new information that we have about it. And one of the things we have is sort of the talking points, the instructions from the Soviet foreign minister to the UN representative from Afghanistan. And from his instructions, he says, you're going to be questioned. Now, make sure that you go on the attack. Don't let them feel like be in the defensive. Go in the offensive. Emphasize, that this is an internal matter. Emphasize that this was a decision made between two sovereign states, the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. Emphasize that the Soviet Union is there because of these requests. All of this stuff, and so there was a lot of coaching behind the scenes in an effort to make sure that this appeared sort of as appropriate as possible to the outside world. And certainly, the Olympics, 1980 Olympics, is probably the first time that people in the Soviet Union got a sense that perhaps not everything is. You could still spin it. Imperialist power is sabotaging the glorious, friendship of the people, sporting exercise. But that was really sort of the first kind of moment where perhaps it became clear that this is not going to play well. The PR is going to be really, really hard to spin.
And we actually saw up on the screen a moment ago an editorial cartoon, I'll call it, of dollar bills going into United States dollar bills going in to assist Afghanistan, helping to rationalize this for the people living in the USSR.
Absolutely. We've seen as forces of counter-revolution destroying a regime that couldn't be allowed to fall.
Well, Dr. Lutz, you mentioned the global community. What was the response?
Well, the general response was negative. It didn't play well beyond the Soviet bloc countries that, of course, felt obligated to support the invasion. In the West, it kind of signified a return to the old style of Soviet direct involvement and coercion, reflective of Czechoslovakia in '68 and Hungary in '56 and whatnot. So it did not play well with the West, and the West generally supported the boycott of the invasion and other things that came along. For the United States, it was a great opportunity to portray the Soviet Union as the bad guy, a role that the United States had got to play in Vietnam and as attacking third world peoples and national liberation. So It was a great propaganda opportunity for the United States, and the United States jumped on the opportunity and took advantage of it. It didn't play well in the Third World in general, because Third World countries, regardless of their ideological orientation, do not like to see that kind of intervention, which regardless of which side it's coming from, and that caused concern in that regard. And of course, in the Middle East, there was a great deal of solidarity for a Muslim population that was battling against secular forces, and it doesn't matter from the Middle Eastern perspective whether the secular forces are Soviet or Western, and they're all equally secular, and also a battle even against, again, from a Middle Eastern perspective, Western ideologies. Of course, West and East, so we never think of communism as a Western ideology, but it is. Karl Marx did most of his writing in Germany and the UK, and that's about as Western as it gets. And so it was a Western ideology that was being imposed on the Middle East, and generally in the Middle East, the reactions to Western ideologies being imposed was pretty negative.
Dr. Livschiz, I'm curious how the response of the global community played out in the USSR.
It's very interesting, and one of the problems. Well, one of the joys of living in the Soviet Union at that time, if you were the government, is that you do have the ability to control relatively well the kind of information people have. And one thing that needs to be made very clear is that from the very beginning, despite all the talk about sort of friendly solidarity and assistance to Afghanistan, it was never presented as a war. It was not even if it was even mentioned casually, it won't even get really mentioned too much until after Brezhnev dies. But it was the fulfillment of internationalist duty. And so what were the Soviets doing? They were building schools. Well, who's going to fault anybody for building schools in a country that, doesn't have a lot of schools, presumably, because there's this kind of assumption that, those places over there don't obviously have too much of really too much of anything. And so as a result, I think it was for a very long time, it was fairly easy for the population to ignore it until, of course, the casualties started coming back, and the veterans, the young men who came back, without limbs, until they started coming back. That was really when it became more difficult. You could still ignore it, but it became more difficult to really ignore that something was clearly going on, and the information provided didn't really match up what was actually happening.
And later on, we will see on the screen several photographs and other images of human beings who were involved in this, Soviet troops as well as resident citizens of Afghanistan, but then also some of the carnage that was experienced during this. So this was not something that could be ignored in some respects. There were people coming home who were very much damaged, obviously injured, and then also killed.
Well, you can't. When the Soviet system, you can't actually ignore them, right? Because you don't have proper supplies for handicapped people. So actually, they pretty much would be trapped in their homes. So again, ignoring them isn't that difficult. But increasingly, as their number, as there are more and more of them, and their families sort of start to be very concerned, that's when you really start to see the problem. But the kind of the public expressions of disapproval, that's going to wait until after Gorbachev comes to power.
Well, what was the fighting like? Where did it take place?
Well, the fighting part of the Soviet-Afghan war is a very interesting one because part of the problem was sort of the unclear definition of what exactly the Soviets were supposed to be doing there. Initially the Soviet troops were supposed to come in, and help organize this change of government, that was going to take place, due to the will of the people. And it changed a lot because it went from sort of trying to install and protect a new government to fighting insurgency, and then eventually to air and ground operations. And so in many ways, the fighting was a perfect illustration of so many of the problems that the Soviet system was experiencing at the time coming out in Afghanistan. You have problems with insufficient training for the soldiers. The soldiers were trained to fight NATO forces in conventional warfare. What they got was something completely different that they were utterly unprepared for, both strategically, in terms of supplies they had, and also in terms of the equipment that they had, right? They had these Western, World War II style, uniforms, World War II era weapons, which were not appropriate. They're functional weapons, but they're just simply not appropriate for the kind of climate that they really had to deal with. The Soviets were used to being the guerrillas themselves during World War II. They were not used to dealing with guerrilla with guerrilla warfare. You have, 80% of the country's mountains. So again, you have a completely different landscape that they were simply not prepared, not really didn't know how to, how to maneuver. They didn't have proper equipment. It turns out that the most prized trophy during the war for the Soviet soldier was getting a Western manufactured sleeping bag from the Mujahideen, because unlike their own sleeping bags, these were warm and waterproof and lightweight. So I mean, this is the, and so it really sort of illustrates the depth, really the depth of the problem. And the other problem that the Soviet troops experienced is that the Soviet Union never deployed enough forces to compensate for the military inadequacies of their Afghan client state. And so just for comparison, the United States had 500,000 troops in Vietnam at the height of the conflict, the height of U.S. involvement in the conflict. Because the Soviet Union had so many other military commitments, right? They had 565,000 in Eastern Europe, 75,000 in Mongolia, 25 to 30,000 in various third world countries. They could never really get more than about 100,000 into Afghanistan at any given moment in time in a country 5 times the size of Vietnam. And so this really, the point of the numbers is that they were never able to occupy the entire country. So there was this tediousness to the process. They would, cleanse the area of insurgency, and then they would have to move on, and then the insurgents would basically kind of come back to that particular area, which then presented a very important psychological problem for the soldier, well, a physical one, because there are all sorts of diseases that also the lack of supplies affected. Eventually they more or less figured out what supplies they needed to equip the soldiers with, but it continued to affect the kind of the medical aspect of it. And so, about 8 times as many Soviet soldiers died from infectious diseases as in the hospitals as died from actual combat wounds. And over 40% of those who served in Afghanistan contracted viral hepatitis, which of course then comes back to the Soviet Union and causes all sorts of problems. But there's a psychological dimension to this as well, and this is where we really get to the nature of the fighting. For the Soviet soldiers, it was a deeply troubling experience because they were told that they were fulfilling their internationalist duty. They were told that the Afghan people were going to welcome them with open arms and they were going to build schools and everything was going to be fine. And that was really not the case at all. And so for many Soviet soldiers indoctrinated in a certain way, learning about war from World War II books, in which you have the evil Nazi occupying forces and the heroic Soviet soldiers, I think many of them found themselves sort of making, if they were able to make that logical leap, they saw themselves as the occupying force, which really kind of, which is not from a psychological point of view, was very problematic. Add to that, the poor training and the supplies, the fact that the officers are selling off their supplies to the Mujahideen for cassette tapes, and drugs, and rugs. So the 3 sort of most valuable things that apparently Soviet officers wanted to get out of Afghanistan. You have these horrible morale problems that lead to kind of rampant drug use and drug abuse, and that's where again we get to the violence and brutality. It's not the point is, one of the things that we have to really remember, and I think, especially thinking about a movie like Charlie Wilson's War, which is probably where we get most recent way in which Americans have an impression of Afghanistan, we have to remember the Soviet soldiers were human beings. They were young men, in a situation where they had absolutely no control of where they were and what they needed to do. But once they were there, there was a wide range of sort of there are some, depending on the commanding officer, depending on the presence of the KGB, there were tremendous amount of brutality, and of course retaliation against civilians, because that is the nature of guerrilla warfare. The civilians are going to be involved, and this in turn causes more drug use and psychological problems. And we have images, I think, that were shown earlier, sort of the brutality, both, and the death toll, the tremendous death toll on both sides.
Jim, a number of the things that Ann has mentioned here were unique to that time period in terms of the weaponry available and the reason for going in. But some of it is constant. The topography of the land is constant. A number of the things are constant. Is this what fighting is like, or what it's always been like in Afghanistan? Is it like today? Is it, or was this a really unique experience?
I think it was probably more commonality than differences. The British tried to control Kabul, and they came in and occupied it and tried to get out, and most of them didn't make it. One of the relatively few major disasters for a Western invading army in the developing world. But that was basically the same kind of process. It wasn't a head-on conflict. It was guerrilla warfare against a marching column. And many of the Soviet columns that were ambushed in the 1980s were variations on the ambushes that were used against the British in the 1800s in their military campaigns. And the warfare today involving the United States forces and its allies against the Taliban and others and groups related to bin Laden and Al-Qaeda that have reappeared, it's the same kind of warfare, and it's hit and run and disappear into the countryside, and you clear an area, and it doesn't stay clear, because the minute you move on, the insurgents come back in. The United States today is facing many of the same problems because of a diversion of resources to Iraq, where many of the same problems that the Soviet Army in Afghanistan faced, the American Army is facing in Iraq today. But the diversion of forces to Iraq has meant that there's been insufficient troops. And this process of training the Afghan forces is a slow process. It's not something you speed it up and you damage the process, and the troops are less able to fight. And so you're getting the same kind of guerrilla warfare, and plus you have huge numbers of people that by now are very well trained in that kind of warfare. I mean, they spent 10 years learning it, and there are skills involved, and they're very useful. And even some of the the Algerians who fought in Afghanistan carried those skills back to Algeria very effectively. It wasn't a huge number, but it was a significant number. The skills that are learned once they're learned, they're there, and there's plenty of teachers. So the groups that are opposed can continue the same kinds of operations, and the insufficient troops on the ground that the Soviets faced is now still a problem for the United States in a more welcoming environment.
We are talking about actually a very large country with a lot of land where people can go to hide and hide out. And for a number of the people, they have known nothing but this. We have to keep in mind that the Soviets came in 1979, basically. So we're looking at close to 30 years where we're talking about a country with a median age of, Anne, I know you looked this up earlier, but 40-some years old.
Yeah, well,
I mean, this is...
the life expectancy
of 40-some years.
Yeah.
These are not folks who can think back to the 1950s or 1960s or what someone might consider to be a better time.
Can I just add something to what Jim said? I think one of the things that I think is really important especially when we're comparing sort of the contemporary situation in Afghanistan and the Soviet war in Afghanistan, is the importance of distinguishing between sort of intrinsic characteristics and the characteristics that are results of decision-making and perhaps faulty and problematic decision-making. Something like mountainous region, well, obviously that's what you're going to have, right? People who don't like outsiders coming in and telling them what to do, again, perhaps intrinsic, although again, obviously the people in Afghanistan were much happier to see the Taliban gone, than they were, to have this unpopular regime kind of slightly retooled and propped up again, versus, things like allocation of troops and allocation of resources. And one of the interesting things is there is an effort to try to learn from the Soviet experience, where sort of, what to do and what not to do. And there are some successful cases of lessons of counterinsurgency skills, where some Soviet commanding officers spent time learning the culture, learning the region. They had their own sort of sources, so that if somebody came in trying to get them, provide them with problematic intel, they had ways to verify it. So I mean, it comes back to sort of you cannot just be dropped in and expect things to fall into place. And there are these there are some strategies that you can use. Of course, you can also just use take the kill 'em all approach, which there are many other Soviet commanders use, and that had very tragic, consequences, mostly for their soldiers, but sometimes for the officers as well, but primarily for their soldiers.
Well, Dr. Livschiz, you spoke earlier about the injured soldiers coming home. What were the effects of the occupation in the USSR?
I mean, that's a great question, and this is where, we haven't mentioned, we've sort of played around with Vietnam, but this is where the comparison to Vietnam, I think, really, sort of Afghanistan as the Soviet Vietnam really comes into play, because, with the difference, of course, that, the United States had a free press, and the Soviet Union did not. And so you have, initially, you don't have any reference to this. I mean, as long as Brezhnev was alive, media pretended that there was no war in Afghanistan. After, occasionally there would be references to Soviet soldiers soldiers, distributing food and medicine, but no mention of any kind of fighting. After Brezhnev finally died, under his successors, you could mention the fighting, but it was always in the context of, glorious Soviet troops delivering devastating blows, against the perfidious robber bands who are trying to destroy the popular revolution. It's only after Gorbachev assumes power that you start to have a somewhat more realistic discussion about it. So there's the political dimension of it, and then there's the human side of it. I mean, these young men and some women, when they came back, I mean, they were in a very, very difficult situation for a number of reasons. One is the trauma, the sort of the physical unacknowledged trauma, both psychological, losing limbs, but also, of course, the psychological one that nobody, was diagnosing, treating, or really doing anything about. The other problem was that they were, when they came back, they had a very difficult time integrating back into society because, especially in the second half of the 1980s, once Gorbachev is in power, this is, the Soviet Union is really going through some very dramatic internal transformations. And for some of these young men, they go and fight, they see their friends die all around them in kind of really horrific ways, and then they come back and they find and they see that they've come back to a completely different universe where nobody cares about their sacrifice for the motherland, and nobody thinks, and in fact they'd rather not think about it too much because there's all this cool stuff going on, and there are all these stories, a brawl because a young man goes to a wedding and there's a waitress there and she's wearing "Made in the USA" T-shirt, and last time he saw something like that was a bomb that blew up one of his friends, and so you have, they really found themselves coming back to a place, coming back to a country that that really no longer existed. And they dealt with it in interesting ways. Some of them became, part of the dissident movement and part of sort of the reform movement. A lot of them formed these kind of bands where they saw themselves as the last protectors of Soviet morality and Soviet life in a society gone, terribly wrong, and they used sort of their violent, skill set to beat up, these funny dressed, people who clearly didn't understand, who listened to the wrong music and, and dressed up in the wrong way. And it's so interesting that they, in a sense, retained the Soviet language that some of the people back home were starting to lose. They would say things like, there's this great quote where, talking about music. Yeah, there was a guy who betrayed us back in Afghanistan, and later we found out he was a disco king back home. So, there's this clear kind of Soviet marker that, you like certain kind of music, you're clearly deeply problematic. You're never going to cut it at the front lines, which is the way to measure whether somebody is really, kind of a proper Soviet citizen or not. But ultimately, the society wanted to forget about them because they were problematic reminders of a non-war that nobody really wanted to talk about. At the same time, though, you do have, especially in the second half of the 1980s with the development of perestroika and glasnost, you have the development of human rights movements, and in part they're fueled by the concerns about what's happening to the veterans and what's happening in Afghanistan. We had the creation of the Committee of Mothers of Russian Soldiers, founded in 1989, an organization that still continues to function today. Now it focuses on the abuses against Chechen soldiers who served in Chechnya. Then it was focusing on the injustices committed against either soldiers in Afghanistan who were illegally drafted or whatever, or families of them who were not getting proper benefits.
Dr. Lutz, what was the effect on the regions surrounding Afghanistan?
Generally negative. It's hard to envision any country that benefited from the Soviet presence in Afghanistan and the conflict that went on. I think that some of the problems that Pakistan is facing today are directly related to the experience. We, of course, encouraged the Pakistan government to send supplies to the Mujahideen, and we actually funneled a lot of our aid through the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency of Pakistan, which really wasn't much of an alternative because Pakistan had intelligence assets in Afghanistan. We didn't. And so we used the Afghans as intermediaries because that worked reasonably well, but of course Pakistan had its own agenda in terms of its involvement there. But one of the consequences for Pakistan was in mobilizing groups on the border areas where people on the Pakistani side had connections, clan and lineage, and connections with people on the other side. They were related to each other. And by far the largest foreign element in Afghanistan were Pakistani citizens, most of whom were not really foreign in any real sense. And they crossed over and they fought on the side of the Mujahideen, and they came back. And again, here's, as I refer to the skill set, that let them look at the situation in Pakistan, which was not all that encouraging to their particular set of beliefs or their goals. And so many of these groups have continued to create problems in Pakistan. So Pakistan had advantages in terms of gaining influence over the Mujahideen, and Pakistan wanted to gain that influence for a variety of reasons, and manipulated the groups that it favored, got more aid, and were portrayed to the United States as more effective groups that, for whatever reason, were not deemed to be pro-Pakistani, came up on the short end in terms of supplies and things of this nature. But the consequences for Pakistan was, initially, of course, you were removing a Soviet regime on the borders of Pakistan, and if Pakistan could infiltrate into Afghanistan, the reverse was always true had the communist regime ever solidified itself, but it was no great danger of ever doing that. So they probably suffered. Iran, on the other side, had to deal with refugees, not nearly on the level Pakistan did, but had to deal with the overflow of the conflict, and it created some economic problems for Iran in a variety of senses, and it became, once the Soviets left, the disorder in Afghanistan during the warlord period, where they were fighting each other, had adverse consequences. The Taliban was not particularly viewed favorably by the Islamic Republic. There's Islamic regimes, and there's Islamic regimes, and in a sense, of course, one might suspect that the Iranian government found that the extreme fundamentalism of the regime in Afghanistan actually had a negative reflection on Iran, because tarred by the same brush. The successor states to the Soviet Union in the north, once the Soviet Union broke up, the problems in Afghanistan flowed over into Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, and not so much Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan, but the three that were closest to Afghanistan. Again, it was easy for people to infiltrate across the border because they were related, they spoke the same languages, and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda was very supporting Islamic movement of Uzbekistan and other groups that were trying to set up similar regimes in those three countries. And so there was a term that has been used, a blowback. It usually refers to the United States, but it actually referred to Pakistan and the successor states of the Soviet Union. So, it's hard to envision every country in the region, and even India, which is one step removed. Once the conflict against the Soviets ended in Afghanistan, and particularly once the Taliban gained power, many of the persons who were training to go into Afghanistan, and many Pakistanis who were training to go into Pakistan and support a true Islamic regime come to power and to solidify itself in Afghanistan, which was no longer the need, looked elsewhere. And then there was Kashmir and India, and so many of them just simply went east instead of west, and so it even had a destabilizing effect on India.
So, and the occupation was about a 10-year time period, give or take a little bit. And you said that the perception back home did change. Can you point to some specific moments where you think the change began, in terms of change in leadership or change in lifestyle? How did it change, and more specifically, when did it really start to change?
We do have to acknowledge that Gorbachev coming to power really made a change, in part because it was possible to discuss it more openly. I think that there was a disgruntlement already in place. For example, the Russians would refer to the country, instead of Afghanistan, they would call it Afghanistan, which is Afghanistan, basically, in Russian, which kind of conveys the approach. You go from fulfilling your international duty to that. It clearly conveys sort of the attitude that the people had at the time. You have tremendous social problems to go along with it, not just the presence of veterans, but drugs flooding into the Soviet Union, tragically in coffins. The coffins that were supposed to be transporting Soviet soldiers would be filled with, they'd be filled with rugs and other consumer goods, but also with drugs. And so this contributed to the social problems back home. And I think that once it became possible to discuss this relatively openly, and you started connecting the dots, connecting the dots on the social costs in terms of veterans, in terms of the suffering, and I mean, nobody I think worried that much about what was happening in Afghanistan. I mean, because they were killing Soviet soldiers who were just there to, they didn't appreciate the assistance that was being offered to them. So it wasn't so much the humanitarian aspect of. That's where the parallel I think between Vietnam and Afghanistan kind of breaks down, because there's a lot of concern in the United States about the atrocities committed against civilians. I think that there was less, it wasn't as openly discussed, and there was certainly a lot less of that. It was more like we have to protect ourselves from this assistance that we're offering. And in part, it was part of the broader questioning of, what is the role of the Soviet Union in the world? If we have Eastern Europe and they don't appreciate us, and we have all these other places that, don't appreciate us, perhaps it is time for us to focus on our own internal problems and stop helping people who clearly, perhaps can't be helped. I mean, there's a certain amount of, I think, racism and kind of, that kind of attitude, like, really, can we really institute socialism in that country? We do the best we can with Eastern Europeans, but, I mean, what can we do with people from the Middle East?
Their consciousness hasn't been raised
yet. Their consciousness hasn't been raised yet, yes, absolutely. And clearly 10 years was not enough. 10 years of building schools and hospitals, nonstop, was really not enough to raise their consciousness.
Well, Dr. Lutz, what was the extent of U.S. During the occupation? What did we do?
Well, we initially applauded from the sidelines, of course, in that the Soviets had gotten themselves bogged down in something that wasn't obviously working very well. But progressively, we channeled more and more aid to the Mujahideen, and in conjunction with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia provided both governmentally and individual citizens, and then, of course, the foreign volunteers. But a lot of money came from Saudi Arabia to support food and medicine and all the other things that go with a successful insurgency, and money went into the refugee camps in Pakistan, a lot of which was from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Gulf. But the United States eventually began to provide effective weapons, including Stinger, which are surface-to-air missiles, which are particularly effective against helicopters because they're lower to the ground, they're slower, they're more vulnerable, but even occasionally could be used to bring down jet aircraft, or also fairly effective against transport aircraft, much less effective against a jet fighter, but less effective against jets, but they forced them up higher, which meant that they became less effective in terms of their targeting. So even when you missed, you accomplished something with that. Anti-tank weapons and things of this nature, again, mostly through Pakistan, because Pakistan had the lines of communication open to the Mujahideen and could get them in. And, of course, this had a tendency, of course, to favor groups located in the south and the east of Afghanistan, because that's where the borders in Pakistan were. We couldn't channel too much aid through Iran, since we weren't really talking to Iran. Iran, some aid did get in through there because the Iranians permitted it, but it wasn't through us or other sources. And, of course, to the north was the Soviet Union, and they weren't opening the borders for us to send aid in. So it did tend to ultimately strengthen those groups on the border in Pakistan at the expense of the ones in other areas of the country. But we supplied more modern weaponry that was particularly effective. And, of course, if you will, one of the positive experiences from our own experience in Afghanistan is we knew what weapons would be particularly effective against helicopters and jet aircraft and armored vehicles because they'd been used against us. Eventually, when the Soviets pulled out, one of the things the CIA did was go back and try to buy up some of the surplus weapons that had not yet been used, particularly the Stinger missiles, because those could conceivably fall into inappropriate hands. And so they placed a premium on buying them back. And I know they bought some of them back, but you could never know if you got them all because there's no way to tell how many had actually been used.
earlier there were a couple slides that showed the damage that could be done to transport vehicles in particular, as well as other types of weaponry. But there was one slide that showed a wonderful segment, or depicted it wonderfully. Not that it was wonderful that it happened, it depicted it wonderfully in terms of trucks being blown up, road being blown out. So people have been able to see some of that. And you started to cover this a little bit, and I'd like to know a little bit more about how and why the decision to withdraw was made. You sort of referenced that maybe we need to be looking at ourselves, but I'm sure there was more to it than that.
A little bit more to it than that. I mean, it's interesting because actually I think it became fairly clear even in 1983 when Andropov was still alive that the Soviet Union was not going to definitively resolve anything, and that they were going to need to find some way to settle this matter. But what's clear, and this is perhaps sort of the difference between somebody like Gorbachev and his predecessors, is for somebody like Andropov, he did not see withdrawal as possible. In the global confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, withdrawing meant defeat. This would make them look bad. This would make them look weak. This would be kind of horrible damage done to the Soviet reputation, and so it had to continue. So it wasn't really until Gorbachev became the general secretary that he really put that on the agenda. We have to really do something about this and figure out a face-saving way of basically getting out. It's interesting to note is before they actually start withdrawing troops, there's a last-ditch effort that Gorbachev authorizes, sort of, let's see if we can win this one. And so you have 18 months of just really horrific, bloody fighting where you see more indiscriminate use of air power, more aggressive Soviet tactics, incursions into Pakistan, actually, in an effort to try to, sort of prevent supplies from coming in. The bloodiest period of the war is that time when they're sort of trying, can we fix this? And when it becomes clear that no, they cannot, that's where the decision to withdraw is made. And it's interesting, there's, one of the things that, I just want to read a kind of a quote from the report done by Shevardnadze, who was the new foreign minister, who replaced the guy who was one of the four, who made the original decision. It's actually kind of funny, they, the memoirs we have of people present at some of these meetings, you have the one remaining guy of the four at the Politburo meeting when they're discussing withdraw, not withdraw, and he's starting to give advice, and everybody's sort of looking at him like they want to strangle him. So please don't speak on this subject. You're the person, the reason why we're in this mess. And they say things like, we all decided, and sort of like everybody knows that it wasn't all, and some signatures were missing, and all this stuff. And so he says, little remains of the friendly feelings in Afghanistan towards the Soviet Union, which existed for decades. A great many people have died, and not all of them were bandits. I mean, the fact that this is being said, right, is really kind of a huge achievement to say that not everybody who died on the other side were actually deserved to die. Not one problem has been solved to the peasantry's advantage. I won't discuss right now whether we did the right thing by going in there, but we did go in there absolutely without knowing the psychology of the people and the real state of affairs in the country. That's a fact. Everything that we've done and are doing in Afghanistan is incompatible with the moral character of our country. And this is the point where they have to make this decision and start to withdraw the troops, and they do, and we saw the images of the withdrawal, and one of the interesting things in the images is that this is reenacted as a glorious return home, and there's, that we have fulfilled our international, duty to Afghanistan. We have built enough schools that we can now, go home, and some of the images that were shown there are photographs of the scenes in these Central Asian towns where, demonstrations are arranged, and there are signs, thank you for, saving us, and thank you for, for fulfilling your internationalist duty. So there's still, it's 1989. The decision makers have more or less admitted that this is this is a disaster, but there's still these public rituals that need to play out in a certain way, for kind of for popular consumption, which is again sort of very 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 striking.
Yeah, but that popular consumption was not all good. One of the slides that we had up there showed a corpse on a tank with a Russian phrase underneath it.
The poster that was shown, it's a photograph of a corpse on a tank, and the caption says, "I came home, Mom," and that photograph is actually the photograph of the very last casualty, Soviet casualty in Afghanistan. Somebody, and it's interesting. It's an extra amid all the stories of horror and atrocities, and it's an extra heartbreaking story, perhaps, because when the Soviet army started to retreat, they finished fulfilling their internationalist duty, and they chose to go home. The Afghanis didn't really get in their way too much. I mean, they were sort of like, okay, you're leaving. This is great. We'll just,
pave the road
yes,
for you.
Yes, we'll clear the road for you.
Yes.
But there was one area where the Soviet commander in charge of of that area was particularly brutal. He was of the kill 'em all approach instead of sort of learning about the community. And so it was there one of the soldiers got out to fix something, and he was shot, as they were leaving. And I think the fact that picture is the one that was made into that poster sort of really underscores the important role that the war in Afghanistan, the disastrous war in Afghanistan, played in galvanizing public opinion back home in the Soviet Union, in the push for reforms and the problems, the many problems of the Soviet system that many people wanted to see addressed.
So, Dr. Lutz, thinking again about the global community, how was that decision to withdraw accepted or received by that global community?
Well, generally quite favorable. I mean, everybody was, the Afghans were happy to see them go. The soldiers were happy to be going, and virtually everyone else was happy to see them go. And I suspect it was probably particularly well received in many parts of the developing world, because here was, again, a Western power that was withdrawing under pressure, and it was seen as a victory for freedom-loving peoples everywhere. I mean, the Soviets went in to help freedom-loving people everywhere, and actually they gave a very good object lesson for freedom-loving people everywhere. It just wasn't quite the one they anticipated.
Who filled the power vacuum left by the troop withdrawal?
Everyone, or no one. Actually, one of the most surprising things about the withdrawal is, of course, everyone expected that the regime in Kabul would collapse immediately, and that the withdrawal would end any aspects of communism in Afghanistan. But it wasn't until 1992 that Kabul was finally, I guess, liberated, as good a term as any. But the regime in Kabul just became one warlord group amongst many, and the country kind of fell apart, and various leaders, some reasonably good, both in terms of administrative and military, some very bad, and everything in between. But there was kind of chaos without the unity that had been kind of imposed by Pakistan from the outside in terms of how it doled out funds. If you weren't a team player, you didn't get the weapons and the money. That fell apart, and because there was plenty of opportunity to acquire weapons from the retreating Soviets and from the partially disintegrating Afghan army, because part of it remained loyal to the regime in Kabul. And so actually part of a face-saving aspect for the Soviet Union is that the regime did last for 3 years, and that they could point to, we left them in reasonably good shape, and what happened, they didn't fall apart, they survived, and what happened later, well, of course, the United States or Pakistan or somebody else was involved, so it was a bit of a face-saving device for them. But it degenerated into warlordism, and then the Taliban took advantage of that, because they provided, when there's chaos, security becomes the first order of business, and the Taliban supplied it, and then what came in the wake of security was much less successful, but they had gained the upper hand, and the warlords bargained themselves into the governing coalition, and the Taliban gained control of 90% of the country. Of course, then that coalition fell apart when the Taliban faced the pressure with the U.S. invasion. The warlords who had signed on just as quickly opted out of being part of the ruling group and changed sides very quickly. So ultimately the Taliban filled the power vacuum, unfortunately.
And, I mean, ironically, of course, the pro-communist regime in Afghanistan has outlived the Soviet regime by a few years.
My question to both of you is, looking back from an historical perspective, how did that event contribute to the end of the Cold War?
one of the big nails in the giant coffin of the Soviet Union. I mean, there were a couple of things that are really important, right? I mean, the Soviet plunge into Afghanistan, sort of it puts an end to the détente period. It kind of intensifies the Cold War during its final decade. It really the other big thing that happens is that the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan really forces the Soviet Union to rethink its third world policy, and then more broadly to rethink the Brezhnev doctrine that Professor Lutz mentioned earlier. And this is where we get the Gorbachev doctrine, basically the doctrine of non-intervention. And now that it has been used, well, it wasn't non-intervention, it was stopping intervention for Afghanistan, but then this non-interventionist policy, that is, even if you're socialist, whatever your problem is, it's your problem now, and we're not going to help you. That obviously had tremendous effect in Eastern Europe, particularly in Germany, the fall of the Berlin Wall, but in other Eastern European revolutions, which we're going to be talking about in some of the subsequent episodes. But the Soviet realization that the Soviet Union is not going to prop up these regimes anymore was a hugely important moment in the Cold War.
I think in some senses, of course, Afghanistan was both a cause and a reflection of the problems in the Soviet Union. The fact that the Soviet Union couldn't commit more troops, and with a huge army, the economic problems that were undermining the Soviet Union were starting to have an effect in the effort in Afghanistan. And so it was both a symptom and a cause, and there's a feedback. And once something starts to roll downhill, getting in front of it just means you get rolled over that much quicker, and you're probably better off chasing it downhill than trying to get in front of it. But you've lost control of the situation. So it did contribute, and it actually probably played a role. Of course, Ronald Reagan was the Cold Warrior, and Jimmy Carter's efforts to get the Soviets to withdraw from Afghanistan by more subtle pressure or economic sanctions, and boycotting the Olympics didn't work, and so that brought a Cold Warrior into, and so it was mutually reinforcing because Reagan was in office and he saw himself as a Cold Warrior, and he was. I mean, he wasn't play acting as a Cold Warrior. That's how he perceived things. Of course, he modified his behavior once Gorbachev was on the scene. He modified it and changed with the circumstances. So it did have a whole vast realm of direct and indirect connections, both as a symptom and a feedback into a cause.
Well, even though Iraq tends to dominate our news today, the United States still has involvement in Afghanistan. Can you speak to what the situation is like there today?
Bad.
One word. Okay, very good, Jim.
I think that. Well, I think the lack. Clearly, if there hadn't been a diversion of resources, and for different reasons, the United States made the same mistake the Soviets did. They never had an opportunity to finish it. The United States had a better opportunity by keeping resources involved in Afghanistan to control the situation, to give the new government more time to stabilize itself, to more American troops. If more American troops had been there, it would have been easier to get larger troop contributions from allied countries because there would be more American troops there. And the more troops you have there, the easier it is to control the situation. It would have been much more difficult for the Taliban to have regained the foothold that they did. It would have been easier, but not easy, to control the border with Pakistan. The diversion of resources to Iraq basically was made. The assumption, Afghanistan's in good hands, we don't have to worry about it, we got a friendly president, everything's going fine, let's move on to the next problem before we've solved the last problem. And if a withdrawal of troops from Iraq, as President Obama seems committed to be doing, but some of them restaging to Afghanistan to regain control, there was a lost opportunity, and now it's going to be more costly to regain that opportunity.
So what do you think the future does hold for Afghanistan?
I'm willing to be slightly cautiously optimistic, and I think that part of it is maybe the last thing I read before coming here, where I think on the one hand it is obviously very tempting to make the comparison between the current situation the United States is facing in Afghanistan and the Soviet experience there. And then going back to the things that Jim mentioned earlier, the British experiences there, and this idea of Afghanistan as the graveyard of empires. But at the same time, I think it's also really important to make sure that we don't sort of overstate the similarities. There are some. The Pakistan problem, the supplies coming in from Pakistan, the insufficient number of troops problem. But at the same time, there are some other things that are different, and that if, again, it goes back to, I think, the point that I made earlier, right? It's not a structural problem with Afghanistan. It's about decision-making and appropriate decision-making. And so if perhaps the goals are kept more modest, right, not completely transforming society and building socialism in one, in another country, if you have appropriate troop commitments, if you have additional international support, you can capitalize on the fact that the Taliban is not particularly popular. I think there was a recent survey done in Afghanistan where the Taliban is seen as the biggest danger facing, the biggest threat in Afghanistan. If all of these can be capitalized on, if perhaps that lesson about learning about the culture, and I think that's that example is very striking. That you have to make sure that you understand the surrounding environment you're operating in, and building on that, you can potentially achieve success, depending, of course, how you define success.
Okay.
Well, Afghanistan also has a history of, it's a very diverse society in terms of ethnicity and between Sunni and Shia and languages, and just very diverse. But it's had a history of the varying groups at least some somewhat minimal level coexisting with each other and seeing themselves as part of the same country. And so there are traditions in the society that can be built upon. The Soviets clearly misunderstood those traditions, and the first communist regime of Amin did everything wrong. I mean, it made the flag red instead of green, which was an insult to every Muslim in the country, and a totally gratuitous insult. I mean, there was no reason to do it because it served no useful purpose and was dysfunctional. But there are mechanisms that exist, and they're not democratic mechanisms, and more group mechanisms where the leaders of the diverse groups hammer out some kind of compromises that work, and that the resources are then part of the compromise. And of course that would be an improvement, and it's a way of incorporating different groups, and rather than eliminating them, you incorporate them, which is generally in any kind of political system, mechanisms for incorporation and co-opting groups are much more effective than brute force. And the Afghan government isn't going to have the brute force to work, but it does have the co-optation techniques that have worked in the past and are understood by the various groups at some level.
Well, thank you all very much for coming today. I want to thank our guests, Professor Jim Lutz from Political Science, Dr. Ann Livschiz from History, students Shane Swoverland and Staci Bougher for joining us. This was a discussion on the Soviet troop withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989. This was one of a number of programs we'll be doing on the end of the Cold War, either events that symbolized or helped bring about the end of the Cold War. This was brought to you by the American Democracy Project, the Department of History, as well as the Mike Down Center for Indiana Politics. Thanks, as always, to CATV for recording and broadcasting this. Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.